Good morning. I hope everybody's doing well. This is Lecture 8, the Baroque Overview. The Baroque period is considered the time frame between 1600 and 1750. This is really one of the only, if maybe just the only, period of music history that actually has delineations. 1600, which we see the birth of opera, to 1750, the death of Bach. So what we see in terms of those musical beginnings, is that Italy at the turn of the century in 1600 was probably the most influential center of the arts, although not for long. First of all, throughout the 17th century, its economy declines, and it is also hit by plague again. Most parts of the southern areas of Italy are ruled by Spain, the Kingdom of Naples, Sardinia, Sicily, Milan. There are the papal states in the middle, which include Rome, but the north is mainly the collection of city-states that is ruled by individual families, so they're semi-independent. One such family is the Medici family, who rules in Florence, and that's where we're going to begin. Shortly before 1600, a group of noblemen met at the home of Count Giovanni de' Bardi to discuss the music of the day, the science of the day, new developments, particularly in the thinking of the Greeks and the Romans, and they called themselves the Florentine Camerata. The Florentine Camerata included the musicians and writers and scientists. They were humanists, following the Greek and Roman ideals of language, music, architecture, math, and science, and focusing on the individual's place in the world, with an emphasis on beauty, expression, and emotion. As I said, they met at the home of nobleman Count Giovanni de' Bardi and included Jacopo Peri, Giulio Caccini, Vincenzo Galilei, and followed the research of none other than Girolamo Meggi, who spent his time in Rome going through the archives. The problem with the music, according to Girolamo Meggi and his followers, was that the madrigal, which was the prominent genre of the courts of Italy, was too polyphonic. There were too many voices. You couldn't understand the text, and therefore there couldn't be enough emotional connection between the singers and the audience. And therefore, they said it was immature, it was artificial, it was affected, it was insincere. They needed to change that. They said too many voices can't express strongly enough the feeling that a single voice can express, that the feeling can be focused through the single voice to the audience. They believed that the Greek and Roman ideal was to affect the listener directly, emotionally, through their music, through the mode, through their rhythm, through their basic musical oratory. And Girolamo Meggi was saying that this is exactly what they should be doing in 1600 to imitate the old Greek and Roman ideals. So what was their solution? It was monody. That is M-O-N-O-D-Y, which means a single voice sings over strummed simple chords. Usually those chords are performed by harpsichord or possibly lute. It is an expressive style where the story can be sung or the text can be sung by the single voice and combine it with music, just like the Greeks and the Romans in their plays. Now the thing is, Girolamo Meggi had nothing really to go on other than just the simple writings that he read in the archives of Rome. There was no recording. There may have been pictures, but you couldn't really tell what the sound was like. So all he had were commentaries and writings about the subject that he found. So a lot of this was basically just simple interpretation or what he thought the music should be, and then shared those ideas with the noblemen, the Florentine Camerata. So they decided this is what we're going to go with, and they went with a simple song, as I said, monody, over simple strummed chords. Now in order to express the text, they used an early style, which I will tell you, called stile rappresentativo. This is a style where the text declamation is the most important to communicate the emotion. Let me spell it out for you. Stile it's long. Stile rappresentativo. It's a very unique sort of recitative-like style that doesn't focus as much on melody as on just the imparting of a natural way of speaking, following the natural ups and downs of the voice. There is really no recitative as we know it yet, but it's certainly the basis for recitative as we know it. There's not really melody, as I said, but rather it's all about the communication of emotion through oratorical and rhetorical properties, which we'll discuss. So the earliest surviving opera that we have is by Jacopo Peri, he was on your list, and it was called L'Euridice, which is our story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Now, Peri didn't write it completely by himself. The text was written by Ottavio Rinuccini, and the music was also added to by Caccini, who was one of the other noblemen in the group, and he had written his own version of an early opera as well. In fact, Peri had also written another opera, but they don't survive. So our earliest surviving opera comes to us in Peri's L'Euridice in 1600. This is the story of Orpheus and the underworld, or Orpheus in Eurydice. So basically, the story goes like this. Orpheus is the son of Apollo, who taught him to play the lyre, and of course Orpheus just excelled at lyre, and he could manipulate emotions, and it was extremely expressive. So he was a singer and a poet and a musician, and he was about to marry Eurydice. And they were both thrilled, they're so very happy. But Eurydice is out picking flowers and in the meadow with her handmaidens, and she gets bitten by a venomous snake. Of course, she dies, and it's up to Daphne, her messenger, to bring the news to Orpheus. So it's a long haul for her to actually explain what happened. She doesn't want to say what happened, but she finally tells Orpheus what happened, and he, full of grief, makes a resolution that he is going to go down to the underworld, and he's going to plead with the gods and have the gods release Eurydice back into the real world, his world. So he does this, he charms everyone along the way to get down to the gods, and then he charms the gods as well and pleads with them to please let Eurydice come back to him. So they say, absolutely you can, but under one condition, and that is that you don't look back until you are in the world. He agrees, and then that's where we see different endings. You may have heard that he does look back. Eurydice is sent back to the underworld, and in some cases, Orpheus is so distraught he goes up and then he's attacked by birds and he dies that way, and there are all sorts of different endings. Now, the ending that Peri chose was one of happiness, because the opera was written for the wedding of Henry IV of France to Maria de Medici. And they couldn't have a terrible ending, right? So they had to end it happily with Orpheus and Eurydice together and full of happiness. So anyway, let's look at part of Peri's opera. First, so we'll look at the messenger scene. First of all, let's look at the pacing. As I was saying before, Daphne doesn't want to tell Orpheus. She doesn't want to bring him the news. And so she has this long, drawn-out introduction where Orpheus is getting agitated because she's not spitting out what she needs to say, and he knows something is wrong. He demands her to tell him what's wrong. So does his servant as well. And, as I said, he's getting very agitated. Now, Daphne, looking at her actual music, has a very limited range to begin the story when she finally does begin to tell him what happened. There are repetitions of single notes. It's almost chant-like. But when she gets to Eurydice's death, she moves quicker. There's a faster pacing. She wants to get it over with. When Orpheus hears the news, first there's silence, and then look at how he has these short phrases. He can't believe it. It's in shock. Just as if you were reacting to some horrible news that your loved one had died. You can't breathe, you can't talk, your world spins. And that's how Orpheus is reacting with these short phrases. When he finally is able to process what has happened, there's a high note range of passion, oh my heart, and he decides what to do. And as he's deciding what to do, look at the rhythm moving forward. It's syllabic, there's pitch motion, rhythmic motion. And you can see when he decides that he's going to go down to the underworld, the passion continues and gets more and more, and it's definitive. This is what he's going to do. And so it's a very different pacing. It's a different rhythmic actions. It's different pitches than when you saw the beginning when he was trying to come to terms with grief. This is stile rappresentativo. It's a representative style of the emotion, very human-like. When you listen to it, listen for the accidentals, the harmonies, listen for the pacing, listen for the rhythmic motion, and get a sense of what this earliest style is about. So pause and listen to the messenger scene. So back to the Baroque. The Baroque term was actually Portuguese, meaning an irregular or imperfect pearl. You can imagine that means it's unique, but also maybe some ways more valuable, but in a lot of ways less valuable. So originally the term was derogatory. In fact, before we get going, pause again and listen to Rameau's Hippolyte Tarissi, The Fates. And just listen to the music. You don't have to know the words, but just listen to the style of the music. And I'll see you in a second. So that was from 1733. And upon hearing it, an unknown critic described it as Baroque because he said it was noisy, unmelodious, and capricious, meaning unpredictable in behavior and mood, and extravagant in its modulations, repetitions, and metrical changes. In around 1750, the president of the Parliament of the Burgundy, Charles de Brosse, said that the facade of a palace in Rome was more in the style of tableware than architecture, and he called it Baroque. The term was used more favorably in art and architecture than it was for music, but it still wasn't as positive as it ended up being. It described the highly ornamented, decorative character of the architecture, and of course of music, as we'll hear, and was very expressive. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here from the Renaissance. The Renaissance legacy in terms of science and ideas was the exploration first of new territories. That established new trade routes. There were new innovations, as we talked about in the Renaissance with the advent of gunpowder and the compass, for example, and maps. And so with these new trade routes, we see the exchange of ideas, of products, creating new wealth. And along with this, the idea of humanism and that focus on humanity. Now, this idea of scientific exploration continues in the 17th century, but slightly differently. For example, the English scientist Isaac Newton, who was born in 1643 and lived until 1727, worked with ideas on gravity and motion. The Italian Galileo Galilei, who lived from 1564 to 1642, worked with the concept of velocity, motion, speed, and of course under the umbrella of astronomy. The German scientist Johannes Kepler, born 1571, died 1630, dealt with the laws of planetary motion. And the Dutch/German/Polish Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit, you probably have heard that before, born 1686, lived until 1736, came up with the idea of mercury in glass to tell your temperature, so the thermometer. So that's what's going on in the scientific community. Works for understanding their world, not exploring it and seeing what's out there, but now taking those ideas and figuring out why things are the way they are. So there's a focus in the Baroque on rationalism. However, it's rationalism with God still at the center or underlying it all. Dr. Robert Greenberg out in San Francisco has a wonderful story. He says, first we have a Middle Ages professor and student. And the student says to the professor, "Why is grass green?" And the professor, his master, says, "Because God made it so." And the student goes off happy. Well, then we have a Baroque master and student. And the student says to the professor, the master, "Master, why is grass green?" And the master says, "Well, the grass produces chlorophyll, which absorbs red and blue light, and it reflects green light, and because God made it so." And the student goes off happy. So what we have is this underlying structure with God, with God in the center, and then what's around it. We see the same thing with architecture and music.
Let's start with architecture. We see an order and a symmetry underlying complexity and ornamentation. For example, in the Palazzo Pamphili in Rome, we can see that each of the archways are very symmetrical. Everything is balanced. There's a structure, and yet overlying each of these structural elements, we can see ornamentation and complexity, the numbers of windows, the archways over the windows, for example. Here's even a more ornate visage in Versailles, France. Again, even no matter the complexity of the ornamentation, we still see the structure and the symmetry and the balance underneath it. Overlooking the Piazza of St. Peter's, again, we can see the symmetry and the balance. Sant'Ivo della Sapienza in Rome, same thing. St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and Christ Church of London. In the artwork, we also see contrast. Contrasts are a major characteristic of the Baroque period. In some, we see them directly in the same paintings, and others we're going to see them in different paintings. For example, light versus dark. We'll see that in nearly every painting. Action and drama on the one hand, and perspective on another. This is a painting, Las Meninas, or The Ladies in Waiting, of Velázquez, and it's a really interesting painting, one of my favorites. This also shows a contrast between reality and illusion. So here we have the painter himself looking at the viewer, or seeming to look at the viewer. We know he's painting because we can see the paints in this easel. And if you look in the back wall, you see a portrait of the king and the queen in a mirror. Are you the king and the queen? Is that what Velázquez is looking at? The girls in front, including the princess and her other ladies in waiting and the dog, are also looking at the viewer. So the perspective is very interesting, as well as different interpretations of this painting. There is action and there's drama, even in the stillness of the situation. We have a rational realism on the one hand in the biblical story of doubting Thomas and putting his finger in Christ's wounds. And at the same time, an expressive and emotional look and focus on that. In the sculptures, we see movement even again in the stillness, in the poses of action, in the faces of each of the people. We also can see the rise of the middle class and the aristocracy. The portrait of a lady, for example, shows with her outfit and her clothing that she is a lady. She is in an upper middle class. Here's some Baroque garb. Here's Louis XIV. And on the other side, to contrast this royalty or this nobility, we have the peasants and the peasant in their peasant outfits. So poverty and luxury, expressivity and emotion versus reality and rationalism. We have movement and action and drama versus perspective, reality versus illusion, light versus dark. And we can see these kinds of contrasts all the way through the Baroque period. At this point, listen to the Brandenburg Concerto No. 5 and write down what you hear in terms of expression, melody, rhythm, harmony, tone color. Save your papers for later, and we'll go over some of the ideas that you've had. Listen for contrasts at the same time as you're listening for characteristics of each of the elements. And again, hang on to your lists. The centers of culture during this time were the European courts, particularly the court of Louis XIV, who reigned from 1643 to 1715. Versailles was his home and became the standard for courts. Courts were meant to impress. They were meant to glorify the rulers. Look at how Versailles might have been in 1715. It's impressive in so many levels. The grounds, the facade of the building. Notice again the symmetry and the balance and the structure underlying all of the complexity and the ornamental decorations. The pool, and inside, one of my favorite pictures, the Hall of Mirrors. And here's the royal chapel also on the premises. The court's purpose, as I said, was meant to glorify the rulers, to impress guests. It was meant to show the majesty of the state, the glamour, the pomp, the ceremony. The courts promoted artists, musicians, and architects. In terms of sound, they used horns for the hunt, trumpets for battles, orchestras for dances and entertainment. Courts sometimes had 2 orchestras as well as opera troupes. Louis XIV had a basic corps of strings, 6 violins, 12 violas, and 6 cellos. Added to that was his festival orchestra, where winds and brass and percussion were brought to impress guests, especially on special occasions. There were opera troupes that were part of the courts and choirs as well. Churches also were promoters of music and became more and more theatrical as popularity decreased.
So how did people, ordinary people, hear music in the Baroque era? Were there concerts? Not so much, really. They were few and far between. Most people heard music if they were nobility or had connections to nobility at courts, but frequently they would have heard music in the churches, or in some cases, like in Venice, public theaters for opera, or in the case of most musicians, they might have heard music in private homes or universities or taverns or sometimes town festivities or in academies, music clubs. The idea of public concerts, as I said, was quite rare. Public concerts mean concerts with admission for a fee. The first one was held in 1672 in England, and then not until 1722 in Germany, and then 1725 in France. So it took a long time to get to that point where what we see when there's no plague, as we call it today, when there's no virus, we of course see concerts all the time. We have them in Congo, obviously. But at that time, it wasn't a thing. So let's talk about the roles of different people. Women, let's start with the role of women. Women were singers, Some could be singers in courts, in, like, for example, opera roles. However, that was only when women were not banned from the stage, or in France where they wanted to have women singing opera roles. Women could be patrons of the arts. They could be hostesses at salons, which are gatherings in, in like a noblewoman's home. They could be composers themselves in some cases. But so they had a little bit more variety in what they were able to do in terms of music. And we'll talk about a female composer in probably the next lecture. Now, how about men? Men were composers and musicians, but they had a different role. They were servants to masters. When we think of professional musicians today, we think of independent musicians who decide who they want to play, what their music is going to be like, where they're going to perform, or they're asked to perform. Well, before, in the Baroque, early, we have the servant, this idea of composers as being servants to the master. And the master was either the church or the kings and nobles of the courts. Men learned to play music through apprenticeships, either through father to son or the apprenticeship with somebody else in return for odd jobs like maybe copying music or other small jobs. The other thing that either men or women could learn music in is an orphanage. And the orphanage didn't necessarily mean that their parents were deceased. Sometimes parents, for lack of funds or just for opportunity, would put their child in an orphanage. And so musicians often were formed in these orphanages. We'll talk about that when we talk about Vivaldi. To get a job now, here's this interesting thing. To get a job, some things are similar to today and some things not so much. For example, usually composers and musicians would have to take an exam. Say for a church organist job, they would have to play for the people who are, they either the former organist or those in charge. And so they would take an exam. They might also have to make a, quote, voluntary contribution to the town or to the organization. Some things, however, were non-musical. For example, both Johann Mattheson and Handel, and even possibly Bach, turned down the same job replacing Buxtehude as organist because a prerequisite was to marry his daughter. And apparently it wasn't a good thing because Handel and Mattheson took one look and said, nope, sorry, this is not going to be the job for me. So anyway, once composers had a job, they had to turn, especially in the church, they had to turn out music quite rapidly. And so this really led to the establishment of form, not just like the medieval poetic forms based on a text, but form that was both for instrumental music as well as for vocal music. They had to be able to produce music at a quick rate, and people wanted to hear new music, not old music. And so the idea of form allowed them to know what they were doing and structure their music, kind of like when you write a paper, right? If you have to write a paper, you basically write the same format for most papers. Your introduction with a broad down to your statement, your thesis statement, and you back it up with your first paragraph supported, second paragraph idea supported, third paragraph idea supported, conclusion. That's a form for writing a paper. And so forms began to develop too, according to what kind of composition it was or what the purpose of the composition was.
So now take out what you wrote about the Brandenburg Concerto No. 5, and let's look at the characteristics of Baroque music, full of contrasts. Let's look at the expression. Expressions or emotions are powerful emotions, but also impersonal. Impersonal meaning that they tend to be detached, as if noted by an impartial observer or the listener. The composer's emotions are at best peripheral. In other words, it's not really important what the composer feels. What is important is what the composer chooses. So the emotional expression depends much more on the purpose of the composition. To that end, one mood or feeling is predominant per large section or movement or piece. We don't find a lot of changing emotions throughout the piece or throughout small sections, but rather there is one choice of mood or feeling per section. This is related to the doctrine of the affections, a title given much later. According to René Descartes, there are 6 basic affects or emotions. His 6 were admiration, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sorrow. Others added to that, including anger and jealousy. Within the doctrine of the affections, these are strong, which were strong emotions that were chosen to portray, again, depending on the circumstance, the piece, the emotions of the piece. In writing compositions, after having chosen an affect, composers would choose different key signatures to represent different affects. Different intervals also could portray different affects. The upward leaps were more joyful. The descending steps were more sorrowful. C major was joyful, and so on and so forth. According to Johann Mattheson, as quoted in Britannica.com, he notes that joy is elicited by large intervals, sadness by small intervals. Fury may be aroused by a roughness of harmony coupled with a rapid melody. Obstinacy is evoked by the contrapuntal combination of highly independent or obstinate melodies. Joy and happiness could be represented by dotted rhythms. A descending bass line, particularly if it's chromatic, could indicate or represent sorrow. Melodies tend to be complex. They are not easily singable, but definitely memorable. If you can remember the melody for the Brandenburg number 5, listen to how it continuously unfolds. And so on it goes. It's not easy to sing. It's not easy to breathe if you are singing, but it's definitely something that you can remember for when it recurs, which is part of the necessity of form. We'll notice that ornamentation, while not necessarily in this movement of the Brandenburg, is often found in the slow movements. As you could hear with the melody that I just sang, rhythm often employs the same patterns. You look at the 16th notes that are running through the score on the right-hand side. It's not that every part always has the same rhythm, but rather if you take a step backwards and you look at the score, you see the same rhythmic patterns running throughout each measure of the score in one voice part or another. It's repetitious, again for familiarity. In faster movements, rhythms tend to be driving forward, and there are always regular accents and meters. In terms of harmony and texture, here we see an interesting thing. The vocal music, as we talked about with the beginnings of opera, is based on the solo voice, the solo singer being able to express the most. In terms of instrumental music, however, instrumental music tends to be polyphonic. This is an interesting phenomenon because vocal music, at least until the classical period, seems to follow vocal music. Vocal music is predominant in the Renaissance and earlier. In the Baroque period, instrumental music follows what vocal music had been in the Renaissance. So in other words, in the Renaissance, vocal music predominated with polyphonic textures. In the Baroque period, the same thing happens with instrumental music, which becomes, as we go through time, as important as vocal music, but we see that the orchestra music or the instrumental music is polyphonic, just like the Renaissance vocal music. What we will see in the classical period is that the instrumental music follows what the Baroque vocal music has done and becomes more homophonic. So it's an interesting thing. I think the instrumental music follows the vocal music. Harmonies tend to change very quickly. In other words, there's fast harmonic rhythm, where the chords may change every beat or every half beat. Unlike the Renaissance, where there was modal harmonies, by the time we get to the Baroque period, especially as we're getting into the Baroque period, there's a focus on major and minor harmonies. Dissonances are there, but they're used mainly for expression and are fleeting. In terms of tone color or timbre, there's a lot of doubling. There's not much emphasis on tone color on its own. Upper strings and oboes double, lower strings and bassoons double. Percussion, which is timpani for the most part, and horns and trumpets tend to double, highlighting the chords. And finally, dynamics. Dynamics go along with the emotional aspects. Dynamics are terraced, meaning stepped up. There are not a lot of mid-range dynamics like mezzo forte or mezzo piano, but rather they tend to be forte and piano. Part of the reason for this is that the harpsichord was used very frequently in larger ensembles, and harpsichords were unable to change dynamics. As the keys are depressed, a plectrum comes up on and plucks the string. It doesn't change with pressure from the fingers. So in order to change dynamics, harpsichordists had to use thicker textures and faster rhythms to create loud dynamics, and thinner textures and slower rhythms to create soft dynamics. There, as I said, there wasn't any middle ground, but rather full or thin, loud or soft. The tuning system changes over the course of the Baroque, going from mean tone tuning, where the consonants of major thirds are more important than perfect fifths. In other words, to sound in tune, a major triad needs to actually lower the fifth, so the major third tuning being perfect or most in tune is more important than the perfect fifth being in tune. To the well-tempered tuning by the time of Bach. Well-tempered tuning means that the octave is divided into all 12 pitches. And although it's not exact, it's done by ear, everything is relatively evenly spaced. It doesn't become exact until the 20th century. And then we have equal temperament. So to finish today's lecture, we're going to compare the Renaissance to the Baroque. In the Renaissance, vocal music is ideal. In the Baroque, instrumental music becomes just as important as vocal music. In the Renaissance, we heard voices in ensembles, for example, the madrigals. In the Baroque period, the solo voice is the more important and the more expressive. In the Renaissance, vocalists are most of the time a cappella, meaning they sing by themselves. In the Baroque period, we hear much more instrumental accompaniment to vocal music. In the Renaissance, we had irregular rhythms, meaning irregular meters, different accents. By the time we get to the Baroque period, we have clear and measured rhythms. In the Renaissance, modal harmonies were used. In the Baroque period, it was functional harmony that was important. We'll talk about that later. Major and minor chords seem to be almost exclusive. In the Renaissance, the music was written for church or court, or outside in the town. In the Baroque, besides the town, music was also written for church and court, but in addition to that was the opera theaters. And finally, in the Renaissance, the expressive technique was word painting, whereas in the Baroque, expression was found through the choice of affections, the choice of an emotion to represent what the piece was about. And so it was a much broader expression. All right, I hope you have a really great day, and I'll see you next time.